December 1944. The Western Front was no longer a line on a map, it was a tightening fist, closing one frozen village at a time. The ground itself seemed exhausted. Roads were rivers of mud hardened into ice, forests stood skeletal and silent, and the air carried that heavy stillness that only comes when an army knows it is being pushed back toward its own doorstep. American units advancing through eastern France toward the German border were discovering something strange in those final months of the war in Europe. In many places, the fighting simply stopped. A white sheet from an upstairs window. A helmet placed carefully on the road. Hands raised before a shot was fired. But not everywhere. Some pockets of resistance remained, not because they could change the war, but because the men inside them had decided something about themselves. Outside a half-destroyed town near the Saar region, an American infantry company halted along a narrow country road lined with leafless trees and the burned skeletons of wagons. The town had been shelled days earlier. Stone farmhouses stood cracked and hollow, their roofs sagging under early winter frost. Recon patrols reported a small German rearguard element holding a cluster of buildings ahead. No artillery. No visible machine gun nests. No movement. Just silence. By late 1944, silence was suspicious. Silence meant someone was thinking. A squad moved forward cautiously, boots crunching over frozen gravel. Their breath rose in pale clouds. They expected one of two outcomes, nothing at all, or quick surrender. Instead, a single rifle shot cracked through the air and struck the dirt near their lead scout's foot. Then another. Not wild. Not panicked. Controlled. Measured. The squad pulled back immediately. This wasn't chaos. Someone disciplined was directing fire. Through binoculars, an American lieutenant caught a glimpse of him. In the doorway of the largest stone building stood a German officer in a long field coat, cap pulled low, binoculars hanging against his chest. He wasn't shouting orders. He wasn't firing. He was observing. Watching the Americans the way a chess player studies the board. Prisoners taken earlier that week had mentioned an older major in the area. A veteran of the Eastern Front. A man who had already lost much and retreated farther than he ever expected. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars slowly. So that was him. A loudspeaker was brought up. A German-speaking corporal stepped forward and delivered the standard call. You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The words hung in the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single rifle shot echoed upward into the sky, not aimed at anyone. Not a miss. A statement. Minutes later, a voice answered from the farmyard. Calm. Almost polite. The officer refused. He stated he was acting under orders to delay the enemy. He would not surrender his position. There were no insults. No propaganda. Just a quiet refusal. The American lieutenant glanced back at his men. They were exhausted. Some hadn't slept properly in days. Their uniforms were stiff with mud and frost. None of them wanted to fight over a farm complex that had no strategic value left. But the road mattered. Command had been clear throughout the autumn campaign: do not leave enemy forces behind your advance. Higher headquarters was contacted. The reply came quickly. Do not bypass. Resolve it. Mortars were positioned but held. Machine gun teams settled into cover. The company commander hesitated. He had learned something in the long march across France, that force was sometimes less effective than patience. He decided to try once more. A white cloth was tied to a stick. An American sergeant, unarmed, walked halfway down the road. His hands were visible. He stopped well short of the buildings and called out again, repeating the surrender terms. Food. Medical care. Warmth. Survival. This time, the German major stepped fully into view. He did not raise his pistol. He simply listened. When the sergeant finished, the major responded slowly. His men were exhausted, he said. They knew the war was turning beyond repair. But surrender, for him, was not merely tactical. It was personal. He had already withdrawn across half a continent. He would not retreat again without meaning. The sergeant asked how many men he had. The major ignored the question. Instead, he asked one of his own. "How much time will you give us?" The sergeant returned to the company commander and relayed the exchange. The commander stared at the farmhouse for a long moment. Then he made a decision that surprised even his lieutenants. 1 hour. 1 hour to reconsider. 1 hour before the Americans would advance. The order spread quietly through the line. Rifles rested against stone walls. Mortar crews smoked in silence. Watches were checked again and again. Time moved strangely in winter combat, too slow when waiting, too fast when bullets flew. At the 40-minute mark, movement flickered near a side building. A young German soldier emerged, hands raised. He walked stiffly toward the American line, face pale from cold and fear. He said the major had dismissed him, told him to surrender if he wished. No one would stop him. Within minutes, 2 more followed. Then another. Each was searched, disarmed, and given a blanket. No one struck them. No one shouted. The Americans were too tired for cruelty. At the end of the hour, the major still stood in the doorway, alone now except for a handful of loyal men inside. The assault began. Machine guns suppressed the windows. Mortars landed behind the buildings to block escape rather than obliterate the structures. Infantry advanced in short bursts, using ditches and broken walls as cover. The German fire was sporadic, determined but thin. Ammunition was clearly low. 15 minutes later, it was finished. Smoke drifted lazily over the yard. One German soldier lay wounded but alive, calling for help. An American medic ran to him without hesitation. War had not erased instinct. Inside the main building, they found the major seated at a wooden table. His pistol lay unloaded before him, gloves placed neatly beside it. He stood when the Americans entered but did not raise his hands until instructed. The lieutenant studied him, a tired face, lined deeply, eyes that had seen too much of Russia's winters and France's retreats. Through an interpreter, he asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. "Why didn't you surrender when you had the chance?" The major answered plainly. "Surrender," he said, "should be earned, not requested." An officer's duty was to resist until resistance no longer held meaning. He wanted his men to see that he had not abandoned his post lightly. The lieutenant nodded. He had heard variations of that answer before. Some were pride. Some were fear. Some were habit. This one felt like something else, like a man trying to define himself at the end of everything he once believed in. The major was searched and escorted outside. No one shoved him. No one tore off his insignia. An American private offered him a cigarette. He hesitated, then accepted. Another soldier noticed his boots were soaked and silently gestured toward a fire barrel where prisoners were warming themselves under guard. Later, during processing, they learned more. The major had served since before the war. He had lost a son near Stalingrad. He no longer believed in victory. That night, he ate the same rations as the Americans guarding him. When an intelligence officer later asked if he regretted refusing surrender earlier, the major paused. He said he regretted the delay, not the decision. And he added something unexpected. The Americans had proven something, not through overwhelming firepower, but through restraint. In official records, the event barely registered. A minor engagement. Several prisoners taken. No American casualties. Strategically insignificant. But for the men present, it stayed with them. They remembered the hour of waiting in the cold. The young soldier trembling as he surrendered. The brief, controlled violence that followed. And the older officer who had chosen resistance, not because it would change the war, but because it would define how he left it. By December 1944, the war in Europe was entering its final, brutal phase. The coming weeks would bring the Ardennes counteroffensive and the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge. But in that quiet farmyard near the German border, something smaller and more human had unfolded. Not heroism in the traditional sense. Not ideology. Dignity. The Americans could have leveled the buildings immediately. They chose to wait. The German major could have surrendered at the first call. He chose to stand for an hour longer. Neither decision altered the course of the war, but both altered the memory of it for the men involved. Wars are often remembered for grand offensives, sweeping arrows on maps, and speeches delivered far from the mud. Yet sometimes they are defined just as clearly by moments when enemies pause, look at one another across a frozen road, and decide who they will be when the shooting stops. Because in the end, victory and defeat fade into history books. What remains, long after the maps are redrawn, is how men behaved when the outcome was no longer in doubt.